from Bantarkabang, Indonesia, it's your anonymous host, Donovan.
Hello there, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Deep Dives in the Shallow End, the podcast where we take everyday things like the plastic surrounding your turkey wrap and turn them into existential crises. Or at least just try to explain them in a way that makes sense. I'm the aforementioned not-so-expert, mononymous host, Donovan, your guide in this dumping ground of knowledge. And yes, before you start, I know there was already someone who went by the mononym Donovan. But come on, people, out with the old, in with the new. And you know what? I think this podcast will be my mellow yellow.
And if you like that timely reference, then buckle up, cool cats. We're just scratching the surface on this whiz-bang podcast.
And on today's podcast, we're tackling a subject that is, well, kind of gross, both literally and figuratively, but also really important. And that's the international waste trade. And before you zone out, let me assure you, we're not talking about your everyday trash. This isn't your Q-tips, plastic bags, my uncle's collection of dolls that he makes from shower drain hair. Old Uncle Russell. You can always count on him to be lurking right outside your bathroom door as you walk out from a nice hot shower. But the world's full of kooky characters. But no, that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today, it's far more glamorous than all that. It's about how rich countries are pretty much shipping their trash halfway around the world to poorer countries. And those countries are, if you can imagine, not super thrilled about it. Think of today's episode as a guide to understanding how that plastic spoon you used for 10 seconds to shovel down some spumoni at your grandma's Feast of San Gennaro, a universally relatable situation, somehow ended up as someone else's decade-long problem. We'll talk about what the waste trade is, why it's such an incredible mess, and how, believe it or not, you and I are very much involved. So grab that ethically sourced coffee or tea or fifth of Everclear, you class act you. No judgment. And let's dive in.
Deep dives in the shallow end.
All right, let's start with the basics. What exactly is the international waste trade? As luxurious as that may sound, it's more exploitative than it is exclusive, like political promises, celebrity-endorsed products, or R. Kelly. The waste trade is when a country, usually a rich one, sends its waste to another country, usually a not-so-rich one. And why do they do this? Because it's cheaper and easier to send your trash to someone else's backyard rather than clean it up yourself. Classic Western capitalism. And picture it. It's the 1980s. Big hair, neon clothes, devil's dandruff, and lots of new industrial production. Cue, mountains of waste piling up. The wealthy countries didn't want to deal with the cost or regulations involved in safely managing this mess. They thought, we're idea guys, we're production guys, we're money guys, we're not garbage guys. So they had this light bulb moment. Why not ship this to lesser countries? Fewer regulations, fewer lawyers, more greased palms? And that's not me calling them lesser countries, but how else could these miscreants have thought about these lesser developed countries if they seriously believed that they would be suitable dumping grounds for the world's literal garbage? Places like Malaysia or Ghana ended up on the receiving end because they had less strict waste laws and no chatty Cathy do-gooders to ruin everything like they have on Twitter, just typing away on their child labor-made computers. But anyway, the 80s really was a time I like to refer to as the golden age of trash, and for so many reasons. And don't be fooled. It's not just plastic that could maybe be recycled if you squint kind of trash. A lot of it was, and still is, mislabeled. That is, garbage pretending to be something recyclable, like mixed waste dressed up as valuable materials. It's like waste in disguise and not even a good disguise. Think of Trotsky trying to apply to his local friendly right-wing militia with his communist armband on. That second glance, that's where the problems start piling up. So what we end up with is an incredibly unequal system. Rich countries save money and keep their grass green, while poorer countries get stuck with toxic junk and environmental headaches. Now, let's get into the different kinds of waste being shuffled around internationally. We're talking toxic sludge, heavy metals, all the hits. All the stuff that I assume leads up to some sort of tragic superhero origin story. I just don't know. I'm not a comic book guy. This is the kind of garbage that would make even a full dumpster behind a carniceria in the summer blush. The kind of stuff that I assume has created the hellscape that is Flint, Michigan's drinking water. Now I realize this may sound like I'm making a joke, but that is a whole other topic caused by the shameful and repugnant acts caused by former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, among others. It's a harsh example, but these real-world impacts show just how severe the waste problems can be. Anyway, imagine shoving all your darkest secrets into a garbage bag and shipping it off to someone who can't afford to say, no thanks. That's pretty much what we're going for here. A big chunk of this mess is electronic waste, or e-waste. Old smartphones, laptops, that old TV that had been stuck on full volume for 3 weeks before the neighbors finally investigated what that odd smell was coming from downstairs. R.I.P. Gramps. But let's not forget plastic waste, which is like the world's worst party guest. It shows up everywhere, makes a huge mess, and never, ever leaves. And fun fact, only about 9% of all plastic ever made has actually been recycled. The rest is in landfills, the ocean, or some kid's playground in Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this plastic is labeled recyclable, even when it's really not, leading the unsuspecting to believe that they are entering into a healthy relationship with a trusted trade partner, but finding out that their problems have only just begun. Like responding to Alex Jones on Ashley Madison. And let's not forget hazardous waste, chemical byproducts, expired medicines, Starship's first album. All the fun stuff you really don't want lying around. This waste gets shipped off to places where people have little protection and a lot of exposure. Remember that carniceria dumpster filled with pig entrails baking in the summer sun I mentioned earlier? Now imagine it's 60 metric tons of that stuff, but full of lead, mercury, and discarded singles of We Built This City. And instead of a dumpster, it's someone's community. It's a sobering thought. But I think we should dive into the effects. And as you can imagine, not good. Countries that get all this waste don't exactly have the infrastructure to deal with it safely. People, including children, are out there breaking down electronics by hand to recover the more valuable metals. Imagine doing this without gloves or masks. They're directly exposed to that lead and mercury, which can cause everything from developmental issues to respiratory disease. So yeah, not exactly the career mom envisioned for you when she took that third job to send you to Venice to learn watercolors, but let's face it, nobody gets your art, Kevin, and the rent ain't paying itself. And if you thought the environmental impact was limited to people, think again. Burning electronics while making for a more beautiful sunset also releases toxic chemicals that are terrible for animals and the ecosystem. Places like Agbogbloshie in Ghana have basically turned into post-apocalyptic wastelands where nothing can grow. It's like Mad Max come to life, but with the population density of Kowloon. Now you might be thinking, isn't this illegal? Well, yes, sort of, in theory. There's something called the Basel Convention, which is not the fun diplomatic mixer held at a Swiss Hilton Express over a long weekend like I was first led to believe. Rather, it's actually a 1992 treaty that was supposed to stop rich countries from dumping hazardous waste onto poorer ones. But really, it just served to make us feel better rather than actually be enforced. It's like me, creating a new diet plan every Sunday while simultaneously just absolutely housing extra toasty Cheez-Its straight out of the box like some kind of animal. In a shocking yet sad side note, the United States has chosen not to ratify the Basel Convention. Well, actually, this is only shocking if you are unaware of the long list of worthwhile agreements and conventions the U.S. has not signed on to. Some of my favorites include the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. They get paid enough. The Convention on the Rights of the Child. Boo-hoo, I don't want to make mud bricks day in and day out. Well, hey, little Jimmy, your dungarees aren't getting any cheaper. How long are your parents supposed to shoulder the burden of your existence? You gotta pull your weight. Then there's the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. To them we say, get a job. And let's not forget the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah, the air's toxic, but look at that LA skyline. But don't for the love of God look down. Ignore the streets, the urban blight, the graffiti, Skid Row, the leagues of broken down cars, the gangs, or the uncontrollable wildfires. Shh. That's right. Just head down Carmelita Way and keep looking at those beautiful palm trees. I realize this is an aside, but it's truly flabbergasting that the U.S. is actively kept from signing on to these conventions, especially when it comes to stuff that protects marginalized people like women, disabled persons, and children. On the positive side, some countries are getting fed up. China put the brakes on importing plastic waste in 2018, calling it the National Sword Policy. Yes, the National Sword. It's dramatic, it's kinky, and I'm all for it. It's their way of saying, we're not your trash can anymore. Now countries are scrambling to find other places to send their waste, like Malaysia or Vietnam, which are also starting to push back. It's kind of like a tragic game of musical chairs except with garbage, and no one wants the last seat. So let's take a closer look at some of these places. Remember I mentioned Ghana's Agbogbloshie, where people were dismantling electronics for their precious metals? They're doing dangerous work, not because they want to, but because they have to. Like me taking my Valtrex, but with far more dire consequences. To highlight this, one worker said to a journalist, "Every day I breathe in the smoke and I feel it in my chest, but I have no other way to make money." And it's heartbreaking. And it's not just an environmental or medical issue. It starts to sound a lot more like a human rights issue, like making another godforsaken season of anything remotely Kardashian related. And let us not forget the time that Canada sent its trash to the Philippines and labeled it as recyclable plastics, but it turned out to be diapers and household garbage. Yeah, that caused a bit of a diplomatic spat. The waste sat in the Philippines for years before Canada took it back in 2019. So here's my warning to less developed countries. If a rich nation ships you anything with the promise of valuable recyclables, take a second look. Because it might just be toxic waste, white garbage, or Ellen DeGeneres. But I repeat myself. So what can we do to fix this dumpster fire of a situation? Well, the worst of it has mercifully been taken care of already. Ellen was canceled in 2022. But as for the waste trade, I've got 3 words for you. Government, corporations, and consumers. Or as I like to call it, the holy trinity of Western capitalism. First, governments need to step up their recycling game. Instead of sending the problem overseas, maybe we could invest in facilities to handle waste properly. I know, it's radical, but it seems like a good idea. Next, corporate responsibility. Luckily, there are already strong responses like the right to repair movement. It's pushing for products that are easier to fix instead of requiring consumers to throw them away. If companies made things easier to repair, we'd have less e-waste. But apparently making life easier for the consumers is not exactly raising the bottom line. And finally, us, the everyday trash producers. We can buy less, recycle properly, and support companies that make sustainability a priority. Remember, every time you buy something, you're voting with your dollars. Unless it's a multi-pack of paper straws, then you're just voting for pollution. You know, that brings up a whole other issue that really grinds my gears: paper straws. We must and can do better. Paris Hilton can get her own cooking show, but we can't make a paper straw that resists turning into a disgusting lump of mushy pulp in less than the amount of time it takes you to finish that first bite of your burger. I don't know what it is. Big straw, misplaced priorities. Either way, the world is upside down and I'm losing sleep. And friends, Daddy's tired. But seriously, as disgusting and less than ideal as paper straws may be, they are still one of the many things we can use to affect real change. So, what have we learned here today? Besides the fact that the international waste trade is a major bummer and perhaps not the best topic for the first show, we learned that the trash we throw away doesn't just vanish, but I think we all knew that on an intellectual level. Rather, it ends up in someone else's backyard, affecting their health, their land, and their future. So this issue needs to be felt on an emotional and humanitarian level. As painful as it may be, imagine children growing up with contaminated water, at best, or families unable to farm their own land. Rather, they are literally housed in these garbage dumps. And by the way, these aren't abstract consequences. They're very real, and they're happening as you're listening to this. We have to be able to move beyond our comfort zones to start imagining the real situation. Once we see ourselves as part of the problem, we can start to be part of the solution. And to that end, we learn that change is possible. Some countries are taking a stand, and initiatives are popping up to tackle waste in new ways. We just have to keep pushing.
Deep dives in the shallow end.
All right, listeners, it's your turn. The first step is awareness, and congrats, you're officially more aware. So take a look at your local recycling program. Figure out what you can and can't recycle. Reduce what you buy, repair things instead of chucking them, and support movements like the right to repair. We cannot keep treating the world like I do my body at Golden Corral, just endlessly stuffing it with toxic garbage. Oh, and look up initiatives like Plastic Bank. They're helping people earn money by collecting plastic waste in lesser developed countries with the support of donations from corporations and people with a few bucks to spare. Which is kind of like a modern day Robin Hood story, minus the archery, but still a total sausage fest. Support policy that tackle waste at its source? This does not and should not need to be any sort of partisan issue. Just because we don't see the problem firsthand yet, it doesn't mean we won't eventually. There's only so many places we can keep hiding trash away, like me in Spanx. And eventually, we're going to have to deal with the problems we are directly causing, like me in Spanx. So write to your local representatives. Tell them you're tired of these policies. The choices we make every day can push companies and governments to do better. And let's face it, the world needs us to do better. So, thanks for sticking with me through the ups and downs of the international waste trade. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and let's all do our part to make a difference. One less plastic straw at a time, at least once we've figured out that whole paper straw technology. Even if it's just one small change, it all adds up. I hope you'll join me next time. Take care.
In the shallow end. Deep dives in the shallow end.